Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us on this lovely spring, April afternoon. My name's Daniella Rose-King. I'm the Whitney Lauder Curatorial Fellow here at the ICA. I'm very excited to be joined by Deborah Anzinger and Danielle Purifoy today. Just to give some brief introductions to both of my panelists, speakers here today. Danielle Purifoy is a writer, lawyer, and the current Carolina postdoctoral fellow in the Department of Geography at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. She received her JD from Harvard Law School and PhD in environmental politics and African American studies from Duke University. Her current research traces the roots of contemporary environmental inequality in the US South, particularly in the development of black towns and settlements. Danielle is an editor for Scalawag, a magazine devoted to Southern politics and culture, and a board member of the North Carolina Environmental Justice Network. Thank you, Danielle. And next to Danielle is Deborah. Deborah Anzinger is an artist based in Kingston, Jamaica. She works in painting, sculpture, and video at the intersection of black feminist, environmental, and geopolitical interrogation. She employs non-traditional materials such as living plants, Afro-kinky hair, and mirrors as openings to intimate and alternative aesthetics of being in the world. Anzinger's work has been exhibited at the National Gallery of Jamaica, Kingston, the Museum of Contemporary African Diaspora and Art in Brooklyn, the Royal West of England Academy in Bristol, the National Art Gallery of the Bahamas, Nassau City, and Sergeant's Daughters, Nicelle Bouchain Gallery, and 47 Canal, all based in New York. Deborah Anzinger and Unlikely Birth is her first US museum solo exhibition. She was also a 2018 recipient of the Pollock-Krasner Grant and founded New Local Space, a contemporary visual art initiative in Kingston that provides a place for artists to experiment with new ideas, collaborate with each other, and engage with the public. So this is this event on Inhospitality is on the occasion of my second exhibition here at the ICA, which is Deborah's solo exhibition, An Unlikely Birth. I just wanted to share a few words about my first exhibition and to sort of briefly introduce the exhibition that's upstairs. I hope you all get a chance to, many of you have already seen it, but get to see it again. And just to sort of plant some seeds for this conversation to unravel today. So my first exhibition was staged this time last year. It was called The Last Place They Thought Of, and it explored how geographical, ideological, and spatial paradigms determine and reproduce uneven social relations. It was a group exhibition of 4 artists' work. They included Torkwase Dyson, who was a collaborator of Danielle's, Lorraine O'Grady, Jade Montserrat, and Keisha Scarville. And it broadly considered how histories of racial, sexual, and economic exploitation have shaped our understanding of geography and the realities of our environment. My second exhibition here constitutes a continuation and a convergence of parallel and intertwined concerns, approaches, and themes. The exhibition brings together an array of existing and brand new works, and it speaks to the plantation as the birthplace of capitalist economies, our social organization, and environmental conditions, as well as to the invisibility and the marginalization of reproductive labor. It does this through an exploration of themes of consumption and renewable energy, spectatorship and participation. Botanicals and stand-ins for organic matter appear in paintings and other areas of the exhibition to trouble notions of the natural and gesture towards more nuanced natures of our relationship to materials. I really believe that Deborah's artistic approach facilitates a new way of interrogating, understanding, and reckoning with the realities of the Anthropocene, which is the geological period in which human activity has irreversibly affected the environment. And it does so in terms of psychological and social space. So today I'm hoping that we can discuss a number of issues inherent to the exhibition, including specific artworks, and their subject matter, as well as visual forms and vocabularies that Deborah has been developing throughout her practice, including the use of certain materials and titles as potential apertures to speak to the urgencies of climate change, the Anthropocene, environmental racism, reproductive labor, and reproductive justice. I hope that the subject of inhospitality will provide a capacious and open-ended space for a discussion to emerge around place, space, the body, the land, the environment, history, and possible futures. Inhospitality has seemed to be a generative topic for how it subverts some of the kind of the more dangerous relationships that have emerged historically throughout colonialism and plantation and tourism and other realities. So I think I would love to start by asking you, Danielle, if you don't mind, if you could just maybe go back a few steps actually to talk about how the law intersects with geography in your own work.
Sure. So thanks everyone for being here, and thanks to Daniella and Deborah for this really generous invitation. I'm just really pleased and humbled to be here, and thanks to my friends for showing up today. So law and geography. So most of the, I guess I should specify when I talk about geography, because I think there's a sense of, very dominant sense of what geography is, right? Mapping, cartography, different landscapes. When I talk about geography, I'm talking specifically about Black geographies. So Black spaces, intentional Black spaces, like historic Black towns and settlements in the United States, mostly in the South. I'm also talking very much about local geographies, right? So I don't work at the level, for instance, of the nation, right, or even the county so much, or parish. I work really at the level of some places like municipalities, but a lot of the Black towns and settlements I work at, the level of are very, very small, what we call unincorporated towns. They're mostly rural communities of maybe typically no more than 5,000 to 10,000 people. So very, very tiny places. And the way that and a lot of these places have their origins, to sort of get at the theme of Deborah's work and of your curatorial work, have their origins in on plantations. A lot of these Black towns and settlements are actually at the very site of former plantations that have been abandoned spaces or kind of cast aside places where Black folks have gathered and tried to create intentional, independent political spaces for themselves, and in some cases tried to create their own kinds of economies. And the way that the law intersects with these places is, I really am trying to think about there are various ways that when people are trying to come together and to create a place, that they want to use the tools of the law in order to protect that space, in order to set boundaries around that space, in order to set the rules of engagement in that space. And my work really argues that at least in the United States, that the efforts of these Black towns and settlements to utilize our dominant laws of our society for regulating local space have been really fraught. And it's because of what we think of as, or talk about as, structural racism, the laws and rules of our society that were set and sort of reset centuries ago, right? Actually did not contemplate places like free Black towns and settlements. And so the attempts of these communities to try to employ the laws to sort of protect their spaces, and in a lot of cases from things like environmental dumping, importation of hazards, total erasure, has been really unsuccessful in a lot of ways. And so these communities have actually had to find not necessarily illegal, but extra legal ways of protecting themselves, in a lot of cases from ecological devastation. So that's sort of the intersection.
Right. And that kind of takes us very nicely to my next question, which would be if you could maybe sum up in your own experience, like what some of the, like briefly what environmental racism is, and maybe some examples of like lived experiences and realities of people that you've worked with or communities you've worked with.
Yeah, so a lot of folks know about environmental racism from the 1980s, the sort of advent of what we know of as the United States environmental justice movement that actually started in my home state, North Carolina, in the 1980s. And really, environmental racism had been defined, right, historically as the like systemic racial inequity in the distribution of environmental hazards, sort of the disproportionate, right, like burdens, environmental burdens that Black and brown and money poor, right, like communities have had to bear, as opposed to the kinds of ecological environmental amenities enjoyed by mostly white folks and wealthy folks. The way that I think about environmental racism is really more in terms of the politics of development at this point, and intersecting with capitalism. So if we think about how capitalism works and how places are developed, places are never developed kind of in isolation, right? So the kind of spaces that you see that you think of as immaculate, well-appointed places are always built through a capitalist system sort of on the backs of another place. And so there's some place that the waste from the construction has to go. There's some place that if there is a water rights in contention, right? Like in order for this place to have all the water rights that it needs, then that means that some other place, right, has to lose it. And capitalism often works, right, and as a kind of zero-sum game. And so, so the way, and that has, as you can imagine, like pretty devastating ecological impacts, both locally and globally. So the way that I think of it, for instance, most of like the early environmental racism cases are around waste, right? Everything from municipal household waste to hazardous waste to nuclear waste, right? Who is bearing the brunt of the ecological and health impacts of that kind of waste? It goes far beyond that, right? It's about not only just who is bearing the brunt of things like waste and the hazards from things like coal-fired power plants, from things like fracking, from things like oil and gas pipelines. You know, we just have had this huge, right, like political movement at Standing Rock, right, around the Dakota Access Pipeline. There's a similar battle that's happening in what we call North Carolina's Black Belt. It's the place where plantation slavery was the most heavily concentrated, in the highest concentration of Black peoples in North Carolina. We have the Atlantic Coast Pipeline, right? There's a whole political battle about that being built right through those communities, right? And the health impacts from there. So those are some examples of the impacts, but those are, right, like that development is benefiting someone, right? Is benefiting a lot of these corporations, is benefiting people in terms of the energy access, but it's always, right, like at the expense of some community. So I think about who is benefiting and who is being burdened by the way that we think about development. And that's, I think, a really useful, I think, framework to think about that, both sort of in the moment where environmental justice and the movement around environmental racism starts, but really these politics go way back, right? And they really go back really to the plantation. So that's, how I try to think about those things.
Yeah, so it's kind of the this like terrible intersection of, which is not necessarily an intersection, but more like a continuum of sort of racial capitalism, plantation economies, and I mean, because it also seemed like from the research, like things that I've read, it seems the distribution of it in the US seems to be remarkably stark, like in terms of the mapping of environmental racism in this country. I mean, of course, the Global South and the Caribbean, other places where Black and brown folks live, seems to be the spaces that are dealing with with the waste, with the environmental catastrophes. Yep. But yeah, so, and Deborah, if there's anything you want to jump in with and comment on, please feel free to.
I mean, I think about some of the points that Danielle is making regarding waste and how that actually intersects with the hospitality industry in Jamaica. Because, when everyone is always sort of trying to lobby for cruise ships to dock because they want the foreign exchange that they get from the cruise ships choosing their ports. But then at the same time, where does the sewage get dumped from the cruise ships? That becomes also part of the burden. So basically, the exchange is, for us to earn that foreign exchange, we also have to take the sewage from tons and tons of sewage in the Caribbean, which, as you can all imagine, impacts the ecosystem, the coastal ecosystem and the coral reef ecosystem. So I do think about that, again, just to bring it back to hospitality or inhospitality, how hospitality sort of becomes that burden.
Absolutely. And while we're speaking explicitly about inhospitality, the painting from whence we took this title of this event is right behind us in Inhospitable. Would you want to share a few words about this painting, what you're thinking about, and in relation to the conversation today?
Well, the work in terms of symbology, etc., references the environment. And I guess I think of inhospitality in this case as a space that's not just an object, but a space that is watching, that is observing, and has its own subjecthood. One of the ways that is addressed in another way in the exhibition is through the installation and the conversation that was recorded for that video. It's about access to information and how just access to the information and environmental crises that we're weathering or that we're dealing with is information that the general public just generally doesn't have access to, and so the space becomes more inhospitable with more access to that information, right? So I guess I'm thinking about inhospitality as a means for survival and as a means for thriving and as a means for sustainability, and also thinking about hospitality, the legacy of hospitality as a space that is penetrated, mined from, or also actually has to just bear the burden of whatever capitalistic developments are underway.
Yeah, and I think that there's some work by folks to think of she's considered an honorary geographer, but a Black feminist scholar, Catherine McKittrick, about what it actually means, right, to dwell in those inhospitable spaces, right? How those places that we create narratives of deficit around actually have, by necessity, right, to build the kind of tools and practices for bringing back, right, their humanity, and tools for liberation, right? So that's, this is, these are things that, we talk about a little bit abstractly in academia, but when I try to sort of make these things more tangible, I think one way of thinking of these things more tangibly is by looking at places that are in ecological crisis, places that have been the targets, right, of hazardous burdens, places that are disparately impacted by by climate change, right? And seeing and really observing what sort of practices are arising in those spaces. How do people survive in those spaces? How do people create communities in those spaces despite all of these things that are happening? And I think my work, and I think this is how it really connects not only to like conceptualizations of like the law, but really about like our relationship to the state, right, and to governance, these like entities that we think of as trying to protect us or supposed to protect us, and something that we try to call a democracy. Oftentimes in those particular spaces, they're having to work completely outside of those structures, right? And oftentimes those structures, when they appeal to them through litigation, when they appeal to them through protest, when they appeal to them through, you know, even voting administrations out and voting in new, ostensibly more progressive administrations, still, right, like are still saddled with the same kinds of burdens, right, no matter what the party. And so I think, like, it's really important to think about those spaces as the most generative, right, like spaces for thinking about what the future actually has to look like, right? What is our future relationship to the government or the law or whatever if none of those tools are actually operating to protect or to save those particular spaces? Yeah.
And are there any like specific examples that you could share with us then about some of those approaches? And if not, or in addition to, like maybe we could also think about some historical sort of events or communities that have been using inhospitality as a strategy for survival.
Yeah. So I think one example, and I think these are examples that we actually don't think of as examples of resistance, like as against the state or mechanisms of survival, but have existed for a very long time and continue to have resonance. So in a lot of the Black towns and settlements that I've been to, a lot of them are what we call unincorporated spaces, right? So they don't have a separate municipal government, right? Like the county, which is, if you have ever attempted to deal with county government, like where you live, is like a very kind of distant, hands-off, right, like kind of government, right? And so what ends up happening is in the absence of a kind of centralized government that is like directly accountable or created by the state, these communities actually build their own kinds of political institutions. So I think a lot about the church, for instance. You'll find in these places where there's like, you know, 1,000 people and like 20 churches, right? Like within like a mile or two vicinity, and you're just like, wow, well, people are just really like religious, or they must really, right, like be engaged, or their churches must be really fractured, right? And it's not that. It's that the churches are actually serving creating different services for that community, right? So there's a community that I always talk about that's in the center of our state. It's outside of a white town, historic white town. Used to be all sort of the same plantation area, right? But this one part, or there are actually several like little communities, but this one part that I think of is called West End. And it's an unincorporated Black community, has been systemically denied like access to particularly wastewater sanitation infrastructure. So they have a lot of challenges around raw sewage, a lot of challenges around illegal dumping in those spaces, and extractive industry that's sort of ringed around them. But they have like their churches, right? Operate as food pantries. They operate as schools. They've historically operated as recreation centers. They've operated and like really sort of created in the aggregate, right? Like the institutions that you think of that a small town, right, might create, right? And it's all private, and you don't think of it as that. You think of these as like civic organizations. But in the absence of like a local government, right? Like this is what becomes the government. They often create something called community development corporations. You'll find them in a lot of places. And these are a little bit more tied to government. They're nonprofits. that are supposed to be, right, were created for the express purpose of like trying to boost development in these like perceived underdeveloped places, which are mostly Black and brown places and indigenous places. But really what they end up functioning as is like almost like micro like governments in those spaces. And there's a lot of discretion, right, within those kinds of structures to really think about, well, what does it mean to like build a locally a community that's accountable to each other, right? That's a secure community that has everything that it needs. And so I really think about, you know, and even in the face of, right, like state repression and all sorts of other things, people have a real commitment, right, like to these places and to maintaining them in a particular way. And it's remarkable to me because it really is happening, right? Like these are not places with police departments. These are not places with all of the regular infrastructure we see, but their relationships to one another are the things that are like tying them together and continuing a community over, at this point, right, over 150 years. Anyway, so yeah.
The question was historical examples of I guess, inhospitable spaces. Well, the most clear or obvious example for me would be, you know, the Maroon Wars, the first and second Maroon Wars that happened in the 1700s in Jamaica, which I think really set the tone for how the country even has developed and to what degree capitalism has succeeded there. I mean, you could say that part of the reason why Jamaica, as compared to somewhere like the Bahamas or Cayman Islands, why it is that we don't sort of have the same access to foreign exchange, which would mean that our dollar would be stronger, is really just a simple fact of the inhospitable nature of the country compared to our neighbors, to those specific neighbors. And a lot of that is really just culturally tied to that history of, you know, the Maroon rebellions and also the treaties that came out of the rebellions, which also those treaties were problematic. So the treaties were won by the Maroons in 1739, after about 11 years of just warring and more British troops being poured or imported into the country to be able to penetrate the interior of the island. But the problems of the treaty was that after it was won, the negotiation that was made with the British was that in order to maintain that autonomy and to maintain the interior of the island as being separate from the Constitution, that the Maroons would agree that any slaves that escaped from the plantations and made it up to the cockpit country would be returned by these Maroons, that particular Maroon communities that were collaborating with the British. But that said, that granted them autonomy, and that space is the cockpit country. Has remained largely underdeveloped space, and then importantly, the space that supplies most of the fresh water for the country, where a lot of the watersheds or really important watersheds exist. So in that way, it's the country, the nation, the island still remains what it's been historically called, which is the land of wood and water, right? A lot of us take for granted that fresh water is always accessible, but there are quite a few Caribbean countries that don't even have rivers. And of course, rivers are a precious commodity, watersheds are a precious commodity. When you think about things like waste management and where exactly the waste goes and how many spaces that there actually are that exist that won't be contaminated by the waste of human settlement and agriculture, livestock, etc. So I think about how that history maps onto the cockpit country, which is threatened right now, but still largely provides most of the fresh water that we access. Yeah. And
it's amazing that like that inhospitality or like the utilization of that by certain communities has like had this political legacy, as well as one of protecting the environment, like you say, other Caribbean nations and other spaces that are much more hospitable and have like these, like Barbados, where my family's from, a really successful tourism industry. It's like concrete city, like, landscapes also, and the kind of, I guess it's thinking about like development in different terms as well, right? Would you like to speak a little bit about the distraction of symbolism, the video, or the installation as a whole, but like the video particularly, and some of the interviews that are included in that, because that's something we were discussing earlier?
Yeah, sure. Well, the installation consists of a home, or it references architecture of what you'd call a shack. Mm-hmm. And I think, it's a structure that is not uncommon, that you find through rural or urban parts of Jamaica and parishes. I wanted to reference that particular structure because of just the vernacular. It references a specific space, a specific geopolitical position, and it really just is a part of the everyday lived reality. And but I also, and then having the visitors be able to access that space that one can imagine is an abode, a place that somebody lives. Having the viewer be able to access that space, I wanted it to be a space that, rather than hosting the sort of curiosity or imagination of the viewer, became a space of labor. Mm-hmm. So at once, the presence of the plants, the trees in there, suggest, or actually does provide this feeling of I have a loss for words right now, but basically a sanctuary, mm-hmm. right? A sanctuary space. But then also, not, even though it's set up as a sanctuary space, not being the function of a sanctuary space, it being a space that is the function of the visitor to actually label. And that for me was a way of complicating hospitality versus inhospitality, who's doing the label, and sort of overturning those dynamics. The specificity of the installation, I wanted to be reference where it is right now, which is Pennsylvania, Philadelphia, and so we use native plants. And I also wanted it to be a space where you really just couldn't do anything but be confronted by these specific accounts of the relationship between this particular space and the space where I live, or where that shack is actually referencing, right? So while it is a space where you would reside, it's also a space for laborable, who's laboring. I wanted that labor to come from the visitors whose curiosities were sort of being entertained.
Mm-hmm. And in some of the audio that's included in the video that's shown in that installation upstairs, sort of touches on some of the broader geopolitical specificities of I guess waste and pesticides and agriculture in Jamaica, as well as the kind of the legacies of imperialism in terms of how lobbies function, and the best interests of the country being put aside in terms of other geopolitical relationships, so US and Jamaica. As well as there's a mention of Marcus Garvey and thinking about black liberation movements, and discussion also of individual and communal responsibility in terms of climate change and in terms of use of pesticides, let's say, and other issues that are all intertwined. Is there anything else? I mean, it's for such a short snippet of audio, it touches on a lot of issues which I think are like really pertinent to other works in the exhibition and this conversation. Is there anything else you wanted to pull out of that, maybe?
Yeah, I think I can briefly touch on the segment of the conversation. Well, first of all, there are two sources of audio that are layered in the video. There's one source is from interviews that I conducted with people who were so inclined to answer questions that I had in terms of their anxieties in their lived everyday realities about the environment and about their access to clean water and just how aware, whether they were aware or not, or how aware they were of even concepts of climate debt. So those are some of the things I was asking, and then that was layered on top of an interview, the IRI FM interview, and I just happened to catch this segment where they were talking about, the Monsanto lobby and Bayer, which, are Bayer and Monsanto are now owned by the same company, which of course is interesting, right? Because one is a pharmaceutical company and one is a company that started poisoning the population. So there's a nice cycle there. The host was mentioning that, for years she was on this program talking about the use of Roundup, which is now very well established as being toxic, and how for years she'd been on our program talking about it, but that her father is a small farmer, and that she had no idea that while she was on this program talking about it, that all of these farmers, including her father, were using this chemical. And so the conversation then became about accessibility to information, and also how is it that small farmers and casual farmers are able to access this restricted chemical, because Dr. Paul Ivy, who was her guest, was saying, Roundup is on the restricted chemicals list, and no one can actually access it without a license unless you're licensed in particular industries. And the host was saying, I've gone into the store and bought Roundup. I've done it. And he's saying, no, you can't. And she's like, I have. And so the argument unfolds, and then finally he just has to say, okay, well, there's probably a breakdown right there in the implementation, but it's listed right there. So I really wanted to capture and use that particular part of the conversation because it demonstrates how the lack of accessibility to information, and then also, even if the information is accessible, who do you actually trust? Because if you can access this thing from the agriculture, from the farm supply store, why would you think that it is something that's going to be killing you, right? Which we spoke about a little bit at the beginning of the. So that is, I guess, for some of the stuff that I would like to unpack, some of the things I would like to unpack from the audio there. One of the accounts two of the accounts reference this reliability and this sort of security that we have with fresh water in Jamaica. Like, we always assume that it's going to be there because we're just so used to it. And then we had a drought about 3 or 4 years ago where it just wouldn't rain. And we had never experienced that. We had hurricane season, nothing happened during hurricane season. And people associate hurricanes with disasters, of course, because we have these super hurricanes happening now after long periods of not having hurricanes. But they're there to sort of regenerate the watershed, etc. So when we've had a hurricane season where nothing happens, as one of the people I was interviewing said, people just had no water. People who had means, more people from wealthier socioeconomic brackets could go buy water, and then everybody else, as she was saying, I don't know what they were doing because they could not buy water. So I just basically, why I use that particular part too was because in some ways it foretells what could happen in a space like the geopolitical north, where it's always assumed there's enough land and resources and that the first places that are feeling that fallout from these climate changes are spaces like Jamaica, are spaces like the Caribbean, Africa, etc. Spaces that have been historically mined for the colonial project or the capitalistic project. And the video also sort of illustrates as well how that colonialism or that colonial project continues, even though we have this sort of symbolic independence, right? We have all of these countries, nations had this symbolic independence in the 60s that sort of swept across the globe, but colonialism and the project continues. One of the things the host was saying was that Jamaica, in theory, has a vote at the table with this, what she referred to as a one world food order, but Jamaica essentially Jamaica's hand is forced to vote along with the United States because of our dependence on the United States for energy, fossil fuel, etc. So, yeah, so I think that's about what I'd want to unpack from the video. Yeah.
Is there anything you wanted to comment on, Danielle?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that's really striking is the resonances, right, of happenings, right, like in Jamaica and these sort of conversations and how they actually are really resonant with a lot of the conversations I'm having with folks in these communities. And even though we are definitely within the United States, right, these are spaces that simultaneously, right, like, you know, all of us who are here benefit from the United States as an imperial project, right? Like, there's no question about it, right? And like simultaneously, everyone is not benefiting, right, like in the same way, and the internal dynamics of this country mean that there are colonies within this country, right? And we've talked about them sort of most notably, right, as in indigenous nations, but the positionality, right, of Black folks in this country, right, like can manifest in those particular ways. And one of the ways in which it becomes sort of the most stark to us is when Black communities, like these communities that I'm working within, like, actually try to assert some form of even local, right, like political independence. You can see very clearly, right, that the entitlements, the political and legal entitlements that you might expect as a so-called United States citizen just do not accrue in the same kinds of ways. And what that means, right, in terms of geographically, right, like what it means in terms of if we're going to talk about like climate change, right, or water access, right? A lot of these communities don't drink their water, right? Not because they actually don't have water flowing through their pipes. Some of them don't. Some of them have had wells that have gone dry because they've been sucked up by the local landfill, right? That is like sort of using that to kind of like put water on the sort of mounting landfill and to sort of control the waste there. We've had several cases like that where, you know, people who had water all of a sudden just don't. But the folks in a lot of the community that I work with the most, they don't drink their water because of the contamination, right? Like the contamination from, and it's sort of like a known thing, right? Like this is something that the community knows. And so what they're doing is they are doing what I imagine folks of means, right, are doing and did in Jamaica during the drought, is that they're finding bottled water. They're paying tons and tons of money, right, for bottled water. You know, they take the risk, right, of like bathing, right, and showering and stuff like that, right, with the water that's there. But they you know, they're like, it's weird, like I'm bathing in it, but I won't ingest it, but I am ingesting it because it's going in my skin. Like there's just all of these sorts of negotiations. And then also when we talk about, right, like the devastation of climate change, people who are forced to migrate, right, like internally within the United States, you see that happening, right, in a lot of these historic Black communities, right? They're the most, when a lot of these places came off, and this is historical, right? And a lot of these places came off of the plantation, were established, they were given the low-lying land, right? These are the areas that flood, these are areas that are the most prone to ecological devastation. Just by virtue of their topography, right? Like, so that's without, right, mining, that's without dumping, that's without any of the other sort of ecological devastation that's accrued to those spaces over, you know, the last 150 years. And, you know, we're seeing, so for instance, I got my start in this work after Hurricane Katrina. I was working in Louisiana for about 3 years on the recovery and really started to notice, right, like who was able to come back, right, like structurally, right, like who was able to like access the resources, even if they had insurance, right, to actually come back to that city, right. And I was talking with Black folks who were like displaced, you know, their entire family, generations of their family lived in New Orleans. They didn't have any family outside of Louisiana. And so now they're like stranded in a place that like, it's like, it might as well be a different country. Like I'm in Las Vegas, stranded in a community that I don't know, and I actually can't find a way to get back because I don't have enough money. And I had insurance, but they want me to match, right? They want me to provide a match for the insurance payout in order to actually access the money that I would need to rebuild, which is not even enough to begin with, right? So, yeah, just like a lot of those like stories over and over and over again resonating within the United States, and then, right, like, and I think one of the fantastic things about being in conversation, right, today is like the connectivities are just so direct, right? Like what's happening in Jamaica in terms of food and agriculture, right, is part of what's happening in Black agricultural spaces in the southern United States that have been totally wiped out and with, you know, land loss and the advent of the advent of big ag, right? Like 30, 40 years ago, right? And so we can see like very clearly the connectivities and then how they lead to these ecological devastations that like are contributing to these climate impacts that we have, sort of both within and embedded within and sort of outside of the country.
There was a text that really drew Deborah and I both to your work, or it was one of the first texts that we cited, which I'm going to butcher now, but it's like, was it along the lines of the kind of like unbearable whiteness of the environmental movement, exactly, and hearing you talk about, you know, particularly how communities throughout the Black diaspora and the global South are those that are like most readily dealing with the effects of climate change and the changing environment or environmental waste and pollution. And yet it seems that the narrative is kind of being driven from, as I guess it's to be expected, from the kind of geopolitical control centers of the North. I want to hope that, and I feel like part of my curatorial practice or my project is trying to highlight that, right, and to try and make space and like offer openings for a Black feminist approach and narratives and testimony to kind of feed into that discussion. But yeah, I don't want to be completely hopeless as well, right? And what are some of the kind of narratives or stories or like examples maybe that kind of give you hope and that, or you're trying to highlight and amplify?
It's really hard to, I mean, I will say, right, like I am hopeful, but like I think my like hopefulness like comes from like this realization that even the kind of like, I came up in a school of environment, right? That's what I have my PhD in. And I've only been out a year, not even a year. And one of the things, even as I was going through that program, that I realized is that like environmentalism will not save us. And I was like, but why won't environmentalism save us? Like what is, and that was the impetus for writing, part of the impetus for writing that piece. And because, one of the struggles that I had, right, while I was going through this program was like, why are we like never like actually talking about the reason, like the themes, which were the reason I came to this program, right? I thought that this was the place where you went to actually learn, like, what can we do, right? Like, within these communities, what tools that do we have to actually meaningfully protect these communities. And I went to law school before that thinking, hey, maybe the law, right? Like, maybe environmental law will get us there. And I think my hope is kind of rooted in, like, a final, like, letting go, that those are the things that will help. And so what it means, and I think this is rooted in a Black feminist tradition, right? What it means is that we can come up with and think for ourselves about what actually works, right? Like, what is it that we actually need? And we don't have to be rooted in these sort of conceptualizations or these practices that have sort of been imposed on us, because we actually know that for a lot of reasons that I won't go into unless you have questions about it, right? Like that, you know, the ways that we have put forward to protect the environment have only functionally really protected white communities, right? And not even all white communities, right? So, like, it's really been important, right, to set that aside, right, and say, you know, what are the traditions within which, right, like Black and brown and indigenous folks, right, have always been able to protect themselves and sustain themselves. And that really means, in a lot of ways, like going back to very, very, very old traditions, right? That means, like, actually really questioning, like, capitalist development ideologies, right? This sense that this, like, linear progress narrative that, like, with every technology that we're building, that we're only getting better and that we're only elongating our lives and we're only protecting ourselves more, right? I think that, like, we can start to undermine those narratives and really start to think about, well, what has kept us safe? What has kept us healthy? Right? What practices do we want for ourselves? And I think really what it does is removes us away from thinking about someone in your audio was saying, like, of the sense that a technological fix will come along and somebody will invent something to get rid of this this problem that we now have because of some other technological innovation, right? No, it's on us actually building relationships with each other. It's on us actually reconceptualizing the kind of society we want to live in that will actually get us closer to what will actually protect us. And that is, like, deeply, right, like within a Black feminist tradition by necessity, right? Because Black women hierarchically in the society globally, right, have always been at the bottom of the barrel. And those people who are at the bottom, those people who are in the spaces that are inhospitable, have to be by necessity, right? They're the least served by the existing system. So they are the ones that are tasked, right, with, like, coming up by necessity with what do we do to survive and what do we do to get to ourselves to a place where we can actually thrive, right? And so that's sort of the thing that gives me hope, not only like that sort of sense, but also that a lot of other people are actually starting to come to terms with that. Right? Like, it's not just me, right? Like, in a corner, there's a whole bunch of people who are like, I've been in rooms with whole bunches of people who are like, yeah, man, we can't do this anymore. We can't do this like this anymore, right? So, like, and actually, we're gonna have to talk to each other, right? And we're gonna have to, like, actually think about what can we do to actually take care of each other and be accountable to each other and to our communities in a particular way that means that, like, I can no longer just, like, be over here thinking, like, I'm in this silo developing this thing, right? And not actually think about everything else that's happening. Yeah, so that's kind of what gives me hope. There's, like, hope in, like, the hopelessness of, like, what we have right now.
Thank you for that. Deborah, do you have anything to add to that, or what gives you hope?
I 100% agree with everything Danielle said. I guess I just add one small thing to that. It's also, like, redefining what it means to thrive and what it means to thrive and what we think of as sustainable. You know, because a lot of what we determine or define as thriving is actually rooted in these definitions that were created through capitalism. Yeah.
Absolutely. I'm going to ask one more question, then I'd love to open it out to the audience, which was to think about, I know that you're doing some research towards this, Danielle, but like looking at the intersection of the environment and reproductive justice, I couldn't help but think, I mean, of course I'm thinking about this for lots of reasons, but within the exhibition, and just when you were thinking about, when you were describing sort of like scientific approaches and like our perceptions of like progress and of like, yeah, what it means to, I suppose, to try and reproduce our present, you know, in perpetuity, like if there's some way that reproductive justice kind of fits in there.
Yeah, so I think of reproductive justice as a movement, and I'm most familiar with the Black feminist approaches to it, to thinking about what it means to actually have a future in which Black people are not dying in the ways that they are dying right now, right? How do you actually produce a Black future that we want to really be in, right? And I think that that's a really important question, not only for people who are having families, right? Not only for people who can bear children, or want to bear children, but also just for our society at large, right? And so I see reproductive justice as really deeply embedded in the politics of, we think of now as environmental racism, and in terms of like capitalism, that in order for, because mentioned the term racial capitalism, these things are very deeply intertwined, right? So our development politics are deeply racialized. That is what produces what we call environmental racism. And what that means is that we cannot actually, in order for, to get to the Black future, right, that Black feminist reproductive justice organizers are thinking about, we cannot continue in this current system, right? And then there are also like very, very practical things about the ways in which what happens to our environment, what we are exposed to, right, like impacts like our ability to reproduce, right? That's sort of like kind of a starting point for thinking about this, is that your actual ability to reproduce is like in all of ours, right? But like disproportionately, right? Like Black women's, like Black and Indigenous women's ability to reproduce is very much tethered to what is happening in their immediate environments, right? And it's not just about ecologically what's happening, right? Or like in terms of hazards and all of those sorts of things. It's also about the stresses, right? Like of racism. It's about like all sorts of other things that feel more intangible, but that are that actually have tangible burdens on our bodies, right? So yeah, I mean, I really do think about these things, and I'm doing research about, yeah, all the ways in which folks are trying to get more in touch. Folks who are working in this realm of reproductive justice are getting a lot more in touch with. I find a lot of those folks are becoming doulas. Mm-hmm. People are really thinking about like, how do we like disengage from this like hospital-driven, pharmaceutical-driven, right, like approach to reproduction, right? And part of that has to do with, you know, maybe y'all remember what happened to Serena Williams when she was having her child, like people's fear, right? Like literally of like, I've had a healthy pregnancy and now I'm entering into this space, right? And I'm endangered, right? I'm not getting the actual care that I need. And what can I do? This is, again, reconceptualizations that go back to old practices, right? Of like, actually, how do we reproduce in a way and have babies in a way that we know that we're taken care of, right? That we know that we're being taken care of by people who understand the risks that may be that we may be under, but then also like, but care enough, right? Like about us, right, in this process, right? So I think there's like dual things that are happening, right? There's the kind of ideological, like, okay, well, for us to get here, right, like some of our practices have to change. What about this old practice, right? What about this practice of, midwifing, like midwifery or whatever? Like, let's see what that does, right? Like, let's actually think about, again, things that require more tangible, what is it called? Instrumental, right, relationships to one another. So that's how I think about those two things together. But I'm, very early stages of like the research for this, but I'm excited to write and talk more about it.
Thank you so much. Do we have any questions from the audience? Yeah.
Thank you. Deborah, I wanted to have you talk about how your art practice works, relates to, is your art practice, is it scholarship, is it activism, how does your art practice fit in with the kind of things you're thinking about in terms of making a change in the world?
I often don't see much separation between my art practice and the life that I live. So I think of, outwardly, these things look like they have specific demarcations, etc. But I see my practice as just an extension of the way that I'm thinking, which then, of course, I think of as impacting, the way that I'm thinking impacting the choices that I make and the sort of extra studio things that I do or jobs that I take. Most artists have other jobs. So the way that I spend the rest of my time. So in some ways, I think of my practice as like almost like an artifact of a particular way of thinking that is in another avenue serving the choices that I make or informing the choices that I make in terms of how I spend my time working or earning a living, etc.
Hi. Thank you both for being here and sharing with us today. I have a lot of thoughts, a lot of rhizomatic sort of flights of thought, so if I'm not very coherent, pardon me. But first, I'm wondering, Deborah, if you wouldn't mind talking about the materials that you use to make this. One way that Inhospitable was framed in my head when thinking about particularly the paintings and not necessarily the installation was clearly like black hair as being inhospitable to people who don't know anything about black hair. But I also have questions for you in particular, Danielle, about your research. Like, on the one hand, I hear you clearly describing how you understand your interest and just the issue of issues of environmental racism to have some sort of resolution, for lack of a better phrase, or alternatives, right, that can be located in Black feminist practices, right, and part of those Black feminist practices being articulated as a sort of finding a way out of no way. But I'm interested in you being more specific about what you mean turning to the spaces that we have we've labeled as disposable, like the types of towns, the rural Southern Black towns in particular that you're looking at, right? And I'm concerned about the implications of turning to those towns as a space to think about alternate ways of being in the world because of what might happen to those places and what we see happen to places like that. And here I'm thinking very much about what's common and material for most of us today, which is gentrification, and historically what we've seen happen with Black black spaces of living and black alternate modes of being in the world. I'm really concerned about those things being wiped out. But then there's also this like black feminist practice that has this sort of disaffective relationship towards the idea of ownership, whether that is about ideology or what have you. So I'm having a difficult time, I guess, reconciling or like dealing with thinking of turning to those places to think of alternate ways of being in the world, but also like this impulse, right, to protect as if there is some claim of ownership, when black feminist practice is really the historical genealogy that is invested in actual liberation and not sort of hiding or safekeeping from capitalism, are about having this sort of disaffective relationship to ownership. So I'm wondering if you could speak more about that.
Yeah.
Do you want me to comment on
Yes.
the materials first?
Yes.
And then, okay. I guess, thinking through the materials and what you were saying about black hair, I really never thought about it as in the context of hospitality and black hair being inhospitable. I was thinking about it more in terms of currency and value. Obviously, the symbolic use of black hair was a very straightforward way to index a particular ethnicity and a particular position in a particular hierarchy, right? How black traits actually rank in that hierarchy, and it being sort of a shortcut to referencing that. I think that it is a valid lens to see, or a valid point of view to see it also as indexing inhospitality too, because typically we that's probably the most vulnerable and first trait to be altered in order to accommodate being acceptable and being able to occupy particular spaces, right? It's the hair. So yeah, I absolutely invite these kinds of like layered and loaded understandings of using these kinds of materials, and that's for me one of the ways that I use abstraction as a device to talk about all of these various dynamics and hierarchies. Was there anything else, or was that the particular material that you wanted me to?
I mean, I was also looking at a couple of the images, right? And I was just thinking about the conversation and the fact that Danielle is doing work on geographies, and you're talking about, or you've situated your work specifically like within the context of Jamaica, mm-hmm. and there's a way where like maps become somewhat, or maybe this is just a projected impulse of mine that I'm trying to be wary of, mm-hmm. but maps seemingly look like an overlay to mm-hmm. some of the paintings, and I was also wondering if that's intentional. And I mean that in terms of like, there's a way that you can trace roots that on the one hand, the way that the hair is situated, it makes it seem like these roots are cut off or become inaccessible. Mm-hmm. And then of course, the key on a map will tell you certain colors mean certain things. Mm-hmm. So that's also one of the ways that I was looking at your work, and I don't know if any of that was in any way intentional. So yeah.
Yeah, I don't really think of them as being cartographic, but I definitely think of them as being, but maps in themselves use symbols and use these particular devices that you're talking about, which I do use in the work, and my work is very much about space and how space is ordered and how material is ordered in that, within that space and that context. So there's that. I think maybe I answered your question, did I?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's a really fantastic, thank you so much for that question, because I've been thinking about this tension for a while. I think there's been kind of an evolution of like myself as a scholar, someone who sort of started out, right, like thinking very, in the tradition of environmental justice movements, right, about the protection of places, right, which has sort of led me to these particular Black towns and settlements, and actually like noticing in ways that I think are important for us to notice and write about and think about. The kinds of community and social and political and economic practices that happen within those spaces. But you're absolutely right that so much of the rhetoric and investment of those spaces is about, right, land ownership, right, tethering, right, to traditional kind of capitalist notions of place ownership or land ownership. And one of the things that I have really been observing, particularly, and have been really anxious about, right, particularly as some of the communities that I've been working with are advocating, becoming successful and advocating for the things they've been fighting for decades for, namely infrastructure, that these things that seem like victories, right, are actually bringing gentrifying or displacement forces in, because those things are not necessarily about the political victory so much as like, oh, now this is a place, right, that people are wanting to invest in, and so now it looks like a political victory, but it really isn't, because we are invested in actually moving you out, right? So yeah, I mean, I think there's a certain tension there, and I've been thinking a lot about, okay, so what does that mean, right? So what it means is that, yeah, we do have to, one of the things that I think will be a necessity, right, is the letting go, right, of property ownership. And it's like, and it's so weird because it's so funny to talk about it that way too, because like there is such an investment in it, but we've never really had true property rights in the sense, right, that, you know, there's not only in the sense of like the fact that a lot of Black-owned land is heirs property. It's land that's owned in common by families, and that's very easy legally to be taken and wiped away, and there's a whole sort of racial politics around that. But then also just like the history of just like straight up land theft, right, from Black communities has been, right, like huge. So there's all sorts of reasons to, right, like disinvest, right, from this sense of land. And so I think one of the things that I'm trying to turn to now is sort of, well, I think that what a lot of these communities are giving us, right, is ways of being in community, right, like ways of community keeping and keeping each other safe, and various community relationship practices that I think will serve us well, right, in the future. So it's so like even if we're letting go of the sense of property ownership, there's something that arises, right, within those spaces, again, right, like by necessity, that can teach us something about our relationships to each other and the things that we might want to sustain, even in the absence of that. But yeah, it's a really great question.
Any other questions?
I think that's a great place to stop. But thank you both so much.
Thank you, Daniela. Thank you, Danielle.